This episode of Zelda News is brought to you by HMK. Click here to see his YouTube channel.
Hey guys, for the 13th episode of Zelda News, we are joined by the hectic HMK. Furthermore, the topic we're going to talk about this week is a debate regarding what makes a Zelda game. Some say it's dungeons and puzzles, some say it's the setting, but essentially this topic has been filled with endless debate. So what was a Zelda game in terms of the past? What is it right now? And what will it be in the future? So now I'll lead it up to HMK to give his own philosophy regarding what makes a Zelda game.
Hey guys, how's everyone doing? It's HMK and it's good to be here on McIntyre Productions. He's a good friend of mine and I just like to get down and dirty with this whole debate or debacle when it comes to the Zelda formula. Now a lot of people have been complaining over the years leading up to the advent of Skyward Sword and A Link Between Worlds that the Zelda formula might be getting stale, that this Zelda formula is what defines a Zelda game. Now of course, what is the Zelda formula? In my perspective, the Zelda formula is not only something that relates to the game mechanics, but of course game progression and story progression and overall story. When it comes to Zelda form, what I believe is you defeat dungeons 1, 2, and 3. You experience a grand story change, and then you unlock the second world or world 2 of the Legend of Zelda, whatever game it might be, Ocarina of Time with the the future timeline, or I should say the future of Hyrule, A Link Between Worlds, and A Link to the Past, where you unlock the Dark World and Lorule respectively. And then after that, you go off tackling dungeons 1 through 6, and after that, it's a big showdown with big boy Ganondorf, and then you call it a day afterwards. But is that Zelda formula something that is legit? Is it something that pertains to every Legend of Zelda game? Now I want to incline to say yes, but at the same time I want to say no, because with recent Zelda games and with some Zelda games, those notions of the Zelda formula has been broken down and been done away with. And with the advent of the Legend of Zelda Wii U, will it continue that trend? Maybe, maybe not. So I'm gonna throw it back to McIntyre Productions before we can get into the real meat of this video.
And I'm glad that you brought up those 2 points, HMK. And really the main point why people argue about this particular topic is that, I guess, the progression of where the Zelda games really came across. Because, for example, from the first Legend of Zelda, things were pretty much straightforward. And as of to now, of course, the Skyward Sword and towards the, I guess, the mystified proportions of what Zelda Wii U may encompass, people are speculating on what exactly is a Zelda formula. And I would use Link Between Worlds as an example. I would say Link Between Worlds tries to go forward to that more non-linear approach, but by and large, it's still a Zelda game. And I want to go through this particular statement. I want to say there's no particular set, definized version of a Zelda formula. The thing is, when I see the Zelda series by and large, you got to the first Legend of Zelda game, which was pretty much non-linear at heart. Things were broken down more about exploration and mystery as premiums in that sense. And then you go off to, of course, Zelda 2, which was pretty much different from Zelda 1 in a sense. I guess it held more RPG elements in a sense, and some people look at that particular Zelda game as kind of the black sheep of the Zelda series. And then, of course, you go towards Link to the Past, which builds off the original formula and expands upon that. And it's personally one of my favorite Zelda games out there in the series. And then, of course, you have Ocarina of Time, which completely revolutionized. It was the first 3D Zelda game. And in terms of the plot, it really expanded on that and brought up the narrative in that sense. And so what I mean by that particular statement is that the Zelda series has always been a revolutionary one. That's why the Zelda series is so, I guess, enamored by the gaming community at large, is because the Zelda series kind of, in a sense, competes with itself. Of course, the Zelda series is a landmark gaming franchise, and by that particular statement, it goes by its particular code of philosophy when it comes to its own formula. And so, of course, there is its own set piece. There's a key road and try to explore dungeons, puzzles, and its whole plot thing coming around. But there's more to that. It's a revolutionary aspect of the gaming industry. And HMK, do you have any more thoughts to add on that?
Oh yeah, I definitely do. The whole aspect of the Legend of Zelda formula, is it something that, is a little bad thing? Is it something that we should done away with? Is it something that defines a Zelda game? And the whole deal with Zelda formula, there's a lot of, hints of linearity when it comes to discussing the Zelda formula. As you said, the first Zelda game, and we all know this, was a big let loose adventure with hardly any elements of linearity. You were just Link, get a sword and go. And that was a great thing that a lot of people had, but of course there was a bunch of people who said, that may have been a little bit too difficult, they needed some direction. And of course there are gamers out there, and there are people who play games out there that need some sort of direction to go towards when it comes to playing a game about adventure or also the game in general. Now that's where the whole Legends of the Formula came about, and I do believe the Zelda formula technically started with A Link Between Worlds, because that's the first game where it, definitely gave you an established direction to go to. Now, is that a bad thing? In my opinion, I don't really think so. I think that games do need some sort of linearity or a sort of invisible finger to point you in the direction where you need to go. But of course, the beauty of the Legend of Zelda games is that along with this linearity, you do have the option to explore the world around you. And I do believe that also is a part of the Zelda formula. But a lot of people love to argue the fact that, Zelda games, leading up to Skyward Sword and maybe A Link Between Worlds always had this finger to point you in a direction where you're supposed to go, that each plot device or plot coupon or roadblock that you had to come across, it was part in itself of the Zelda formula. Now of course, when it comes to the Zelda formula, we've seen games follow a very, 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 very similar motif from A Link to the Past. We have A Link to the Past, then Ocarina of Time, of course Majora's Mask that came afterwards, and then we had Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, and games like Skyward Sword in some retrospective that follows an established formula. And of course we've had hints from that from the Game Boy games or the handheld games with the Oracle games and A Link to the Past, in which you start your adventure, you complete a certain amount of dungeons, which maybe is 3 or 2 in the case of Wind Waker. You complete 3 dungeons, and then a massive story, some massive plot coupon is given to you, and then you continue your adventure from then on. And after that point in the game really opens up for you to explore in more ways than you did before completing those initial 3 dungeons. Now, of course, with the whole deal with the Zelda formula and story-wise, there's also aspects of the Zelda formula when it comes to mechanic-wise, where you go into a dungeon, you expect to get an item that helps you with the dungeon and helps get you past the boss at the end of the dungeon. Now, of course, this mechanic was kind of, thrown out of the way or thrown out of the books with the advent of A Link Between Worlds and maybe its ancestor, A Link to the Past, where certain items to defeat bosses had to be acquired outside of the dungeon. And that approach is great. Now, when that approach is, not that, where you do get item within the dungeon that helps you defeat the boss, a lot of people like to complain about that, especially Aaron Eager after Hansen with his whole sequelitis about Legends of A Link to the Past versus Ocarina of Time. He says, I wonder how to beat the boss when I get a bow that obviously hits things at a distance. I wonder how am I supposed to beat the boss? Oh, the boss is floating off in the distance. I wonder what do I use? Oh, let's get that bow that we got in this very same dungeon. And a lot of people like to use that as a basis to contradict the whole basis of, is this game a full-on adventure? No, it's linear, it's limited. And of course they love to say, hey, Zelda formula, bam. A lot of people like to rebel against what is established as the Zelda formula, and that is why I think Nintendo created games such as Skyward Sword and A Link Between Worlds, which were 2 big deviations from the Zelda formula, where of course Skyward Sword was a bit, well, actually I would say it's a lot more linear than other Zelda games, but of course it was a lot more condensed, taking pages from Metroid and running with it, where you would be placed in a very condensed, a very monster infested world, and you will go to certain dungeons in certain places, and you will have to go back to certain dungeons for or certain areas for more secrets, more story elements to unfold. I thought it was a lot more story driven and more linear approach, but of course it took notions of the Zelda formula and broken down. You can acquire certain items that you need to progress in the game outside of dungeons, and yada yada yada. And of course, with A Link Between Worlds, you buy the items and decide which dungeon you want to go to, which I thought was a very, very good mechanic. But of course, it put the whole tapper on the storytelling. So of course, Skyward Sword had the whole good storytelling, linear approach, where A Link Between Worlds had the great exploration approach, but it was lacking, in my opinion, a little bit with the story. But I want to get what you think about the Zelda formula and how it affects Zelda games.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the point between linearity and non-linearity, because I think that's really what all this argument kind of boils down to, is that a lot of Zelda fans complain about linearity versus non-linearity. I understand why a lot of people want non-linearity nowadays, but I believe a lot of people are thinking games that are linear are a bad thing, which I don't necessarily believe it's necessarily be a bad thing. For example, Skyward Sword, by and large, yes, it's very linear compared to most Zelda games. Does that make it a bad game? No, of course it wasn't, because I honestly love Skyward Sword. And the thing is, going off with that, because especially with the new upcoming Zelda Wii U, it's told to be open world quotations on that open world, since there's many interpretations on that according to many interviews, that Zelda Wii U will have this whole non-linear approach, and it's kind of based on the first Zelda game in that sense, and kind of, I guess, bringing back towards that roots. But in this whole age of different gaming mechanic and this whole different philosophy, I guess in that aspect it would also be considered evolutionary in that realm, because gaming 20 or 30 years ago is completely different than what it is now. Before, games were a lot more linear, and of course it kind of steadied up and towards player decision, of course, to non-linearity. And Link Between Worlds, I would say, would be a pretty good indication of how the Zelda series is kind of morphing into something else. That's what's alluded to by IG Aonuma and Miyamoto as well, because you brought up the point that you pretty much buy all your items from Ravio's shop and then you just go off in whatever dungeon order you want to go, which I thought was really, really well, actually. And when people try to argue what is the Zelda formula, they always bring up non-linearity versus linearity. If you want to go original about that particular mechanic, I would say to compare the first and second Legend of Zelda games. The first Zelda game, as you said, was pretty much open loose. People were just left to their own devices to traverse the world. Like, there wasn't really much direction going on with that whole philosophy of gaming. And it had to be that whole invisible finger, as you said. And towards Ocarina of Time, that invisible finger, or I guess Link to the Past as well, was the plot, the story. And in the original Legend of Zelda, there wasn't really much of a story because of the whole hardware limitations. There was a story, but it was just kind of there. In my view, the Zelda formula heading towards is that the plot directs the player and the gaming kind of is a means to that end, where the gameplay kind of is your pilot and you're mechanicizing towards that end, and your plot is just a navigator and where to go. That's how I would label things. Any thoughts?
Oh yeah, I've got a multitude of thoughts. When it comes to labeling games and the whole necessity of linearity, of course, pointing you in a direction, a lot of gamers like to, like you said, they like to use that as a basis to bash a game. But of course, like I said before, some gamers need to have some sort of direction. And what you said about story, that's a great way to specify how gamers or people playing a Legend of Zelda game can be pushed to go in certain directions. Now, the whole advent, what you said about Legends of the Wii U, from what IG Aonuma said and what from Shigeru Miyamoto said, the game does plan to be a sort of an open world, a vast world that is begging to be explored, because exploration seems to be a very, 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 very stressed factor of the Legend of Zelda Wii U, constantly saying that, hey, listen guys, we are taking a lot of inspiration from the first Zelda game, which of course, took the training wheels off and, hey, here's a big world, go explore. Have fun. I do believe that's a great way to, point Legend of Zelda in that direction, but of course, will the Zelda formula, quotation marks, affect that? I believe it will in certain aspects where it does need a story in order to, push the narrative, because of course, that's what I love about Legend of Zelda games. And like I said in a previous video, that's the holy trinity of Legend of Zelda games. Combat, exploration, and puzzles with story smack dab in the middle. It needs it needs to find that delicate balance between those four subjects in order to be a great Zelda game. Now, if this Zelda game, Legend of Zelda Wii U, were to take the footsteps of the Legend of Zelda, the original Legend of Zelda, I really fear that it might not have a great story. And AJ Aonuma did say in an interview that he wants to have Zelda Wii U to have great cutscenes on par or better than the upcoming Hyrule Warriors game, which I've seen the cutscenes and they are freaking amazing. But at the same time, I don't want story to sacrifice any other aspects of a Zelda game or the Zelda formula when it comes to exploration, puzzle solving, combat, or the whole notion of linearity. Now, at the same time, we have to, weigh in these two factors. Do we want something to be linear and to have a great time, or do we want to try and have a good time ourselves? And that's what, in my opinion, it boils down to the Zelda formula. It tries to appease all that. It tries to please all facets of that. It's like, hey, listen, this is a world you can explore, but, this is the way you have to go in order to push the story forward in order to complete the game. You have all those options in front of you, but it boils down to people complaining about one factor too much and not realizing the other factors. Like, hey, listen, this is an open world, you can't explore it. But it's like, I want to. That's all I want to do. I want to explore this game. I want to be surprised. It's like, okay, I understand it, and you can't be surprised if you decide to explore this world. But at the same time, here's the story, here's the linearity, here's what pushes you forward in this Zelda game, here's the formula. But of course, at the same time, I really don't like saying the Zelda formula, because I think that's, in my opinion, I think that's really, really utter bullshit. I understand what people are seeing, what people are saying, and what people are pointing at. But this is not something that only affects the Zelda games. It's something that affects games in general, and that's what I have to say about the Zelda formula.
I'm glad you really put out that particular statement, because the thing is, I think fans really want to say there's a Zelda formula for the sake of argument. And what I try to discuss in that particular statement is that I believe the Zelda formula is not so much as a formula, but a living, breathing gameplay mechanic. Because obviously, as I said before, each Zelda game is revolutionary as opposed to evolutionary. That each particular game has its own distinct flair, and I guess cohesive Zelda games are similar in a sense towards each other. Of course, there's a constant basis of gameplay mechanics, but there are certain twists that give that game or a particular game in each component of the series its own unique flair and style. And when I'm really trying to get final thoughts on this whole Zelda formula shebang, I would say, is that the Zelda formula isn't set in stone. It obviously isn't. It's a revolutionary aspect that goes by each form of development. And as opposed to the first Zelda game, as towards now, the current one that's available towards the public is Skyward Sword, there has been a revolutionary aspect. It has guessed this whole view of linearity versus non-linearity is a way for the Zelda series to stay fresh, because obviously it does compete with itself at times, because it is considered to be the pinnacle of gaming mechanics in general, really, is that it does compete with itself, and because of that burden, it does have to keep itself fresh. And so it can't just stay with one set of mechanics, or else it will get stale eventually. Because obviously it has to adapt, it has to change to move forward and still be considered one of the greatest gaming franchises of all time, which I think it still holds true today. And so I think we discussed pretty much everything we need to discuss on this whole Zelda formula thing. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had loads of fun doing this. If you want to see more, you could go see HMK's channel and this whole video regarding the Zelda timeline. Click here to see it. And anyways, this has been HMK
and McIntyre Productions.
And we'll see you guys some other time. Thank you.
I wanna be Pikachu! Pikachu!